Welcome to Wiki Science YouTube channel. In this video, we'll be talking about cerebrospinal fluid and its circulation. The content of this video will cover the aspect of the definition, the volume, the function, regions of circulation, the ventricular system, the flow, development, as well as the clinical significance. Let's get started. What is cerebrospinal fluid? Cerebrospinal fluid is a clear colorless fluid found within and around the central nervous system. Do not forget that when we mention the central nervous system, this implies the brain and the spinal cord. The cerebrospinal fluid is derived from the plasma and it is produced in the ventricular system. But when we talk about the volume of the cerebrospinal fluid can be determined from the rate of flow, and the rate of flow is about 0.3 ml per minute to 0.4 ml per minute. This implies that this rate of flow is in minutes, but in days can be around 400 ml per day to about 600 ml per day. This tells us that the volume of cerebrospinal fluid, is about 90 ml to 125 ml in circulation. What is the function? The function of cerebrospinal fluid is to act as caution to prevent the brain and spinal cord from injury. However, it also serves the function of providing nutrients to the brain and the spinal cord. Not only that, but also helps in the removal of waste products of metabolism. The regions of circulation of cerebrospinal fluid can be divided into three different regions. What are those regions? The first is the site of production. And when we talk about the site of production, this refers to the ventricular system, which we talk in detail later. We also have the site of flow. The site of flow include the subarachnoid space, we have the cistern, we have the medial canal, as well as the sulcus or saucer. The last site is a site of absorption. The site of absorption. And this is referred to as the subdural space. It occurs in the subdural space. These are the regions of circulation. Now let's go into detail about the ventricular system. There are four cavities. That make up the ventricular system. Four cavities make up the ventricular system. The first is the right lateral ventricle. Now, how do we get this? To identify this position, to identify this location, we will take the coronal section of the body. When we take the coronal section of the body, it divides the body into the front and the back portion. From the front portion, you can have the features of what you have on the right as well as what you have on the left. Now, in this region, you get to know that we have two cerebral hemispheres that make up the cerebrum as a whole. Now, in the cerebral hemisphere, on the right of the cerebral hemisphere, we have the right lateral ventricle. And on the left of the cerebral hemisphere, we also have what we refer to as what? The left lateral ventricle. Collectively, we call these two the first and second lateral ventricle. We call this the first and second lateral ventricle. The third ventricle is found beneath the cerebrum around the thalamus. You have it around the thalamus. So we have the third ventricle, which is located around the thalamus. Why the fourth ventricle? The fourth ventricle is found in the region bounded anteriorly by the pons and the medulla and posteriorly by the cerebellum. So the space in between this separation is called the fourth ventricle. Now let's get to understand this more better. We'll give a clear diagram for this ventricular system. Do not forget that we want to take the coronal section of the body now. So it's going to present to us what you have on the right and what you have on the left. Now on the right, you have the right lateral ventricle, and on the left, we have the left lateral ventricle. Now these two ventricles are separated by a septal or a septum. This septum is called septum pellucidum. So this particular portion that separates the two ventricles is called septum pellucidum. However, the right lateral ventricle and the left lateral ventricle communicates. They both communicate with the third portion called the third ventricle through a foramen. This foramen is called foramen of Monro. Foramen of Monro. Now, the third ventricle extends further through what we refer to as the cerebral aqueduct, which is a canal. It extends further through this canal into the fourth ventricle. And here you have our fourth ventricle. This is the fourth ventricle. Do not forget we say that the fourth ventricle is found in a region bounded anteriorly by the pons and medulla and posteriorly by the what? Cerebellum. So this is the fourth ventricle. Now this fourth ventricle then continues down through medial canal where it extends into the spinal cord. So it extends to the spinal cord through the medial canal. So this region is found in the spinal cord. This is the regions of circulation. These are the regions of circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. Let's talk about the flow. The flow of cerebrospinal fluid in ventricular system is said to be unidirectional. It is unidirectional. It's said to be unidirectional, meaning that it takes only one particular direction. How? The right ventricle actually secretes the cerebrospinal fluid into the third ventricle through foramen of Monro. This is our third ventricle. The left ventricle also secretes the cerebrospinal fluid into the what? Third ventricle through the same foramen of Monro. Third ventricle makes contribution to the cerebrospinal fluid, and the contribution made by the cerebrospinal fluid flow through the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. So we have it in the fourth ventricle. On getting to the fourth ventricle, the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid away from the fourth ventricle into the central nervous system, that is the brain and spinal cord, is multi-directional. So when we are talking about the central cerebrospinal fluid in the central nervous system, it is said to be what? Multi-directional. How do we have it to be multi-directional? Meaning that when the fluid gets to the fourth ventricle, there is a particular foramen on the right lateral side and the left lateral side through which the fourth ventricle opens. This lateral ventricles is called foramen of Luschka. It's called foramen of Luschka. Also, anteriorly, you have a foramen through which this particular canal also opens, and it is called the medial aperture. It's called the medial aperture. From this position, which you have your ventricular system at the fourth ventricle, to as supply, it goes through the medial canal into the spinal cord, and through the foramen of Luschka and the medial aperture, it flows into a region called the subarachnoid space. So it means that this particular region now is bounded by the subarachnoid space. This region is bounded by the subarachnoid space. So this is the subarachnoid space. By the time this cerebrospinal fluid enters the subarachnoid space, it goes in a multidirectional unit or flow. Downward, you can have it downward, and you also have it upward. As we can see in this particular structure here, it is said to be multi-directional in its flow. It's multi-directional. Now let's take a cross section at this particular unit so that we understand better what we have here. When we take the cross section at this level of the between the pons and the medulla downward to the spinal cord, we're going to have something like this, in which you have this particular part as our medial canal, And this region you have, there is an opening here, and this opening is called, you can see it opens forward. This opening is called the medial aperture. While you have opening on the sides, the opening on the sides, it's referred to as the foramen of Luschka. Through this foramen, the cerebrospinal fluid flows anteriorly and laterally. It also flows downward into the spinal cord. While it flows anteriorly and sideways or laterally into a region called the subarachnoid space. So this is used to represent the subarachnoid space. From here, the cerebrospinal fluid continues upward to the regions of the cerebrum, where we have the sulcus and you have the cistern. The sulcus is a depression into the lobes of the cerebrum. So it continues into the sulcus and it also into the cistern. Now let's see what happens after that. So it flows into the sulcus and the cistern, so this region of the subarachnoid space. The third site is the site of absorption. What is the site of absorption? That is the subdural space. Let's identify what the subdural space is. To get the subdural space, we take a section of the brain. You have something like this. We have the frontal lobe, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So here you have your pons, your medulla, and you have your cerebellum here. And let's take this portion as our spinal cord. What happens here? There are three layers that cover up the central nervous system, that is the brain and the spinal cord. These three layers are called meninges. So meninges are layers that covers the brain and spinal cord. And these three layers are, we have the pia mater, we have arachnoid matter, and you also have the dural matter. Meaning that the closest layer to the brain and spinal cord is the pia mater. This matter is a covering made up of tissue that covers or attaches itself completely with the brain and spinal cord. So this particular structure we've drawn, we assume it to be our pia mater because it attaches itself closely to the brain and the spinal cord. Now the second layer is the arachnoid matter. The arachnoid matter is separated from the pia mater. Is separated from the pia mater through a space. The space you have here is called the subarachnoid space. It is called the subarachnoid space. Then you have another layer. This layer is called the dural matter. The dural matter serves as the third layer to the brain and spinal cord. This layer called dural matter, however, is made up of two layers. We have the meningeal layer and the endosteal layer. The meningeal layer is in close relation with the arachnoid matter. So you can see it in close relation with the what? Arachnoid matter. While the endosteal layer is separated from the meningeal layer, but this particular endosteal layer is attached to cranium or the skull. So if this is taken to be our skull, I'll just stop here. So here we have this particular one to be the cranium, the bony structure that covers the brain. So the cranium, this is the cranium. This layer is then called the endosteal layer. This is the endosteal layer. The space created between the meningeal layer of the dura mater and the endosteal layer of the dura mater is called the subdural space. This is the subdural space. Do not forget from where we stopped that there are different foramens that opens into the subarachnoid space. This is the subarachnoid space. Now we have the flow of fluid in the subarachnoid space, which is this region. This is this region. We have the cerebrospinal fluid flowing in different directions: upward, downward, forward, backward, through foramens. Through foramen. The first foramen is called the medial aperture, or you call it the foramen of Magendai. The second foramen is the foramen of Luschka, which opens laterally. So it opens into the subarachnoid space through this foramen mentioned, and it continues upward and downward to the brain and the spinal cord. In a particular region, mostly in the upper part of the brain, we have the layer of arachnoid matter to make projection upward, which pierce the meningeal layer, this meningeal layer, into the subdural space. So now we can have a projection from this region. We can have projection at this region. This projection is from the arachnoid matter and opens into the subdural space. Each of this projection is made up of what we refer to as villi. So we now call this arachnoid villi. But the collection of this projection, so this projection here is an arachnoid villi. An arachnoid villi, let's take it like this. From the arachnoid matter. This particular villi collectively we call the villi arachnoid granulation. Arachnoid granulation. So it means that through arachnoid granulation, cerebrospinal fluid flows into the subdural space, a region in which the cerebrospinal fluid is then absorbed. Let's talk about the development of the development of cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the development of cerebrospinal fluid goes along with the development of brain and spinal cord. These begin with three layers, which have ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. In between the mesoderm, you have the neural tube. But this neural tube is having coupling at the cranial portion and the caudal portion, which we refer to as the neuropore. By the time the neuropore closes, it gives you a closed neural tube. This neural tube at the cranial part begin to swell to form the 1/3 cranial rostra, while the remaining caudal part will be taken as a 2/3 caudal rostra. This one-third cranial rostra develop into the brain, and the quarter to third rostra develop into spinal cord. The one-third cranial rostra begin to swell and it begin to enlarge to give three foldings. You have the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. The quarter to third rostra still remains the same, and it begins to develop into spinal cord. The prosencephalon develop into two more swelling, while the rhombencephalon develop into two more swelling. These two more swelling of the rhombencephalon is taken as the metaencephalon and the medioencephalon, while the two more swelling of prosencephalon is taken as the telencephalon and diencephalon. But the mesencephalon here remains. So the telencephalon develop into the brain, into two cerebral hemisphere, while the diencephalon develop into the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, basal ganglia, and the rest. While the mesencephalon remains, the mesencephalon develops into the midbrain, while the metaencephalon now develops into the pons, while the medioencephalon develops into medulla. From this metaencephalon, that is where you now have a backward swelling which forms the cerebellum. Okay, so in this region you realize that you have around each of the swelling you have a particular layer. What is this layer? The pia mater, which fuses or attaches itself close to the particular swelling, while there is another layer that separates from this swelling directly, which is called the arachnoid matter, creating the arachnoid space. Now here, the first part called the rhombencephalon is where the choroid plexus that produces cerebrospinal fluid is firstly found, and later it is found in the region of the two ventricles, the right and the left lateral ventricles of the cerebrum. That is where you also have this second choroid plexus. The third choroid plexus then is found in the fourth ventricle during development. The first one is found in rhombencephalon. The second is found in the two right and left lateral ventricle, which is also referred to as the first and second ventricle, while the third choroid plexus is found in the fourth ventricle. In a nutshell, it is simply stated that what is responsible for the secretion of cerebrospinal fluid is the choroid plexus. What forms the choroid plexus? Let's just take one of the ventricles. Don't forget that the choroid plexus is found in all of the ventricular system, first, second, third, and fourth. So let's take one of the ventricles. We take one of the ventricle to be like this. Now, this is it. Let's take the part of the cerebrum. The blood supply to the cerebrum here is through what we refer to as the choroid artery. Why the blood supply is taken away by what? By the choroid vein. So it means that in between the choroid artery and the choroid vein, what do we have? We simply have the choroid capillaries. So let's take this now to be our choroid capillary. Choroid capillary. The inner ventricular layer is made up of epidermal cells. So these epidermal cells, they coil around the capillary. To make a contribution. So this is our epidermal cells, or the epidermal layer. They coil around the choroid capillary, While the third contribution is made from the outer layer that goes along with the what? With the folds of the cerebrum, the gyrus of the cerebrum. So here, this particular layer make contribution to this particular plexus, and this is called, do not forget, it's called the pia mater. It's the one that is in close relation to the layers of the what? Of the cerebrum. So these three is then referred to as what? Choroid plexus. This three is referred to as choroid plexus. So it means the secretion of cerebrospinal fluid is from the choroid plexus, which consists of the pia mater, the choroid capillary, and the epidemial cells of the inner layer of each ventricular system. Then let's move to the content of the cerebrospinal fluid. The content of cerebrospinal fluid is derived from the plasma of blood capillary. So here you have the sodium ion present, you have the chloride ions, you have glucose. You do not have, or let's just say we have a very, very low amount of protein. You have very low amount of protein in this sense. So you can have chloride ion, sodium ion, you can have potassium, you can have water molecule, and the rest of them glucose. But the only particular substance that is found in the most least amount is protein, like albumin and the rest of them. Now we have the clinical significance. What is the clinical significance of cerebrospinal fluid? Significance. We start with the first one is hydrocephalus. What is hydrocephalus? This is the accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricular system, which may be due to either injury, it can even be as a result of congenital disease or blockage. And this in infants can cause the swelling of the skull, and this swelling can cause the head to enlarge abnormally. So in this case now, immediate treatment will be required, and the treatment here will be ventriculo-periosteal shunt, in which the cerebrospinal fluid is directed to another cavity. Now, the second one is idiopathic intracranial hypertension. We won't talk much on this, but what I want you to know is that this is as a result of increase in cerebrospinal fluid pressure. This is always caused as a result of increase in cerebrospinal fluid pressure, and when that occurs, it can cause something like alienation of the layers of the meninges. It can cause alienation here. It can even cause some other diseases to take place here. The third one we're talking about is the third aspect will be the cerebrospinal fluid leak. In cerebrospinal fluid leak, the consequence of this is that the characteristics of this is that it's always characterized with hypotension of cerebrospinal fluid, and this will rapidly generate or cause headache, and the headache grows with movement. This must be immediately attended to so that the body can regain its normal function. So these are the clinical significance of the cerebrospinal fluid. The first is hydrocephalus, that is accumulation of the cerebrospinal fluid in the in the ventricular system. Idiopathic intracranial hypertension, as I've told you, this is characterized with what? Hypertension of the cerebrospinal fluid due to the cerebrospinal fluid. The third is the cerebrospinal fluid leak. In this case now we have hypotension of cerebrospinal fluid, and this is always as a result of the fact that the cerebrospinal fluid flows into the space between the skull and the endosteal layer. So that is the consequence of leak in this sense. To summarize quickly, we said that it is the cerebrospinal fluid is a clear colorless fluid found within and around the central nervous system. The volume is about 90 to 120 milliliter. We have the function is that it helps to protect or caution the brain from what? Injury, and also it serves as a supply of nutrients and removal of excretory substances. Regions of circulation, we divided into 3 regions. The first region is the site of production, the second is the site of flow, and the third is the site of absorption. The flow is unidirectional in the ventricular system and multidirectional in the what? Is multidirectional in the other part of the central nervous system. Development is from the ectoderm. It develops along with the what? The brain and the spinal cord. The clinical significance is based on hydrocephalus, the idiopathic intracranial hypertension, and cerebrospinal fluid leak. Thank you.